The sky above Coruscant was a slow river of chrome, lacquered by the last light before the city's night took hold. Ahsoka walked with the current of airspeeders, their contrails threading between Durastio canyons and amber-lit spires. The smell of ionized air mixed with fried spice cakes from a vendor cart and the faint tang of rain, the artificial sort that drifted from a ceiling far above where no one could see the seams. The closer she came to the temple, the more the background hum of the city was joined by something older, a resonance that touched the edges of her montrals like a remembered song. Home, and not home. A threshold she had crossed once, and then sworn she would not cross again. Her cloak bore the soot of a night 2 districts away, where a family-run repair stall had burned after a transformer blew. She had stayed, with 2 blue blades lighting a corridor of smoke, until the last of the children were out, tongue of flame reflected in the plates of a mother's cheap kitchen droid, as it held a basket of heirloom tools. Ahsoka had taken nothing for it. She had slept with her back to a crate, listening to city water patter through a fractured eave and counting heartbeats until dawn. In the hours between, the Force had come silent and sure, the way it came sometimes in defiance of her will. It had offered a feeling not unlike a hand extended across a gulf. It had not spoken words. It never needed to. She turned off the main terrace and onto a smaller balcony. A place of glossy stone that drank the city glow and returned it in muted gold. The temple rose before her, its stepped pyramids and needle spires set back from the cliff's edge, like the shoulders of a great creature at rest. She had approached this entrance 1,000 times, with Anakin's stride beside hers, with his jokes, with his impatience that warmed her, even when it exasperated her. Now she approached alone, the air cooler near the stone. 2 temple guards straightened, their helms bright as moons. Yellow blades lit space, and were then gone with twin sighs. Ahsoka paused, because everything in the air told her this was not the same as the last time she came here as a supplicant. Then she sank into the bow the temple deserved. Not for the council, not for the order, but for the generations of younglings whose feet had worn the stone smooth, and for the simple idea that began it all. One guard's posture changed. Not hostile. Surprised. "State your purpose," came through a voice modulator, not unkind. "I'm here to see Master Yoda," Ahsoka said. It felt strange to keep her hands away from her lightsabers, though no one had asked. Strange to name him at all. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She could have said, "I have a weight on my chest that won't lift unless I try." She could have said, "I keep hearing the war in the way the air moves, and it makes me afraid for a man I love like a brother." She looked into the faceplate and remembered the day she left. The pressure of the guard's pike across her path, the finality of it. "But I think he'll see me." The guard tilted a fraction. Ahsoka felt questions. Protocol, a quick inventory of the past's echoes. The second guard flicked a glance to the first. Ahsoka did not press with the Force. The order had taught her patience before it taught her to leap, and though she had failed that lesson often enough, enough. "I'll inform the council," the first guard said. "Please wait." She stood there long enough to feel the pulse of the city fall into a lower gear. Night deepened. Holos ignited on towers like constellations adrift. Somewhere in the temple's upper levels, a choir of young voices began a simple cadence lesson and broke into laughter. A kind of bright sound the war hadn't yet learned how to swallow. Ahsoka's hands found each other, fingers lacing, pressing hard, then easing. When the guard returned, he inclined his helm and stepped aside. No triumph rose in her. No rush. Only the same slow river, moving her across an old threshold. The corridors were as she had left them, only the light different. More dim, more blue, a temple's night. Statues watched with stone serenity. The air carried the scent of oils, of woven mats, of the faintest memory of rain. In a cross corridor, a Padawan slowed to stare, and then remembered their manners and made an awkward bow. Ahsoka nodded and moved on. Her steps soft, her montrals reading the shape of the space. In the floor's minor imperfections and the walls' ancient seams, she could feel history. A story of thousands of hands in prayer and practice, of feet moving through forms, of masters speaking and failing and speaking again. The council chamber door stood before her, more round than square, a frame for a sky view that took her breath as it always had. Behind it, voices. They sounded like wind through threads, like something whispered by a stream. They sounded like memory. She inhaled, and before she could second-guess herself, stepped through as the doors parted. Chairs, in a circle. The city beyond. The room empty of storm, yet the storm always present in the silhouettes of those who sat within it. Mace Windu's gaze, accurate as a blade. Ki-Adi-Mundi with his fingers templed. Thoughts stacked like stones. Plo Koon, whose presence came to her like a winter sun, thin and clean. Sizi Tian, Ayla Sakura in her seat as a substitute, and Yoda small and old and vast where he always had been. Jimera stick across his knees. Obi-Wan was on a distant mission, she noted, absence like an open chair left at a family table. Anakin was not here. The realization touched her and passed. Fulcrum returns to us, Plo Koon said first, voiced the shape of compassion, though he did not use the code name the network had given her in the outer levels. He used the old name that meant child, that meant foundling. Ahsoka bowed again, each vertebra aligning in an angle she'd learned before she knew herself. I'm not speaking for the network, she said. I'm here as myself. Yourself, yes, Windu said. Not unkind, but with that precise dryness that had sanded the edges off more than one of her youthful speeches. What is it you seek, Ahsoka Tano? She did not hurry. Ace to stand, she said. For a time, and a chance to do the work that needs doing with the people I respect. I left because you didn't stand for me when the world turned against me. I survived because what you taught me had roots. Both are true. So is this. The Force keeps drawing me back to this building. If I ignore that much longer, I won't be listening to anything. Not the war, not the people I'm trying to help, not myself. Yoda's ears had not moved in all her speech. They ticked outward now, the gesture almost imperceptible. Listening you are, he said. Wise this is. Hard it can be. Then tea. It's more than that, Ahsoka said. She could feel her pulse in her fingers. Something's wrong in the currents. It's more than battles lost or ships gone. The clones. I've fought beside them since I was 14. At first I thought this feeling was grief in advance, or fear dishonestly dressed as foresight. But it's not that. It's like a pressure change before a storm. I've felt it before. We all have, in small ways, and then the battle comes, or the betrayal, and we say we saw it. But this is larger. It feels like a hand moving across a board I can't see. And every time I breathe late at night, it feels closer to the center. Nendersons. Ayla's chin inclined. You believe this hand moves from within the Senate? The Separatists? The Outer Rim leadership? I don't know, Ahsoka said. She could have named the Chancellor. The thought came to her, and went like a shiver one convinces oneself is nothing. She saw, for a moment, a yellow-eyed smile that was never shown to her, and could not have been. She stood very still within herself, and let the thought pass. I know Anakin is at the center of everything, because he always is, and because he attracts gravity. I know he needs someone who can argue with him without making him take it as an insult. He needs Obi-Wan, yes. He needs me too. No. Windu's expression did something small. Plo Koon's hood shifted. Ki-Adi-Mundi was already building a response when Yoda rapped the Jimmer stick once on the floor. Make my counsel. The nature of your return does, the old master said. Not to lead armies. Not to carry a general's weight. But to teach, and to listen. To stand, as you say, where the younglings learn, and where the wounded sit at night and think. This war, if won only by ships and blaster fire, lost will be, Ahsoka swallowed, eyes burning in a way that had nothing to do with tears. I don't ask for rank, she said. I don't ask to be called anything but Ahsoka. I'll take a training room, and the time others aren't using. I know what it is to sleep on a floor. And mentorship for the young ones, Ayla said, half question. And the old, Ahsoka said. And whatever else you ask that lets me stand near what matters. Windu's gaze completed its small shift toward Yoda. We lost someone when she walked away, he said, admitting it like a surgeon naming a miscut. We may recover something by letting her stand where she chooses, night or not. Yoda nodded, and the sound his stick made on the floor was softer this time. Welcome you we do, he said. One condition there is. His eyes gleamed, amused at her alertness. Dinner with me. Stories to tell. Breath left her on a laugh she had not expected. Yes, she said. Master. Plo Koon's masked face inclined. Then, it is settled. They did not vote so much as they breathed around the circle, each adjusting stance, a fraction. Outside, an airbus drew a luminous line across the view and was gone. Ahsoka left the council chamber not relieved, not light, but surely anchored. She moved down halls that had taught her feet the measure of their length, and detoured past a viewport where she could look down into the room of 1,000 fountains. In the city's night, the pools had been dimmed but not silenced. They whispered, a collection of small falling waters, whose combined murmur called to her like buckles, loosening after a long march. She rested her forehead against the transparent steel, and looked until the evening pulled itself around her shoulders. She thought of Barriss, of how something so gentle could be transmuted by conviction, until it cut like a blade. She thought of the white roofs of shanties stacked under a mag tram line, where a boy had given her back a spare filter she had lost. She thought of Anakin's laugh, and Anakin's silence, and the idea of both tingled her skin like a change in the weather. She did not find him then. Instead, she found Captain Rex in the temple hangar, because habit and the Force sometimes braided into one rope. She heard his voice first, that clipped amiability, joking with a pilot about a navcomp that had pretended ignorance until threatened. He turned at once. The movement halted just short of proclamation. This is where you've been. Then he stepped toward her, and something in his stance, careful, expansive, made her let go of the last defensive wire inside her chest. She went to him and grasped his forearms, and he clasped hers, and they stood like that with the hangar's wind loosening the edges of their cinematic reunion. Sir, he said, because habit was stronger than joy. Then he shook his head at himself. Ahsoka. She took in the scuffs on his pauldrons, the paint rubbed thin over a ridge where he adjusted his weapon too often. He had a bandage across one knuckle in the exact place he always split when he stripped down a rifle in the field without gloves. You look like you haven't slept since the last time I slept. I could say the same. Heard rumors, he said lightly. Heard the Undercity grew a phantom and started telling people to duck before the crossfire. Thought that sounded familiar. Then his voice softened around the edges, as if the hangar itself might bruise. You okay? There was no easy answer. She knew too much to lie. I'm here, she said. That was all the balm she could offer, and all the truth she could hold. The council said I could use the training rooms. I might start with the basics. It's been too long since I broke a sweat without someone shooting at me. Basics keep us alive, Rex said. He gestured toward the ramp of the gunship beside him. We spin up for Felucia in 30. I'll be back after if I'm lucky. I'll tell Jesse and Kix. They'll want to know. Fives would. His voice stopped with clean discipline. He didn't fumble or apologize. He just let the space after the name be, like a small altar. Ahsoka nodded. I know. She hadn't known Fives well. She had known the shape of his attempt to warn them, the size of the silence that followed. She had known what it was to be sure and not be believed. She put a hand on Rex's shoulder plate, the same place she had braced him when they took fire in a canyon that smelled of wet clay and chalk. Come back, she said. Always the plan, he said, as if plans were ghosts that could be made flesh by saying them. He gave her a small salute that wasn't regulation and went up the ramp, his boots ringing like a rhythm she wanted to memorize forever. The gunship's engines woke, and then were shrill, and then were gone into the night, while the hangar still hummed with the echo of their leaving. Ahsoka stood, breath shallow, and then turned toward the interior corridors again, where lights marked paths like constellations an archivist had named long ago. She found a training room with a polished floor, and a faint smell of chalk and warmed metal. A rack of practice sabers gleamed under a modest lamp. Mats were rolled tight and stacked in a corner. The knots on two were poorly tied. Ahsoka set her cloak aside and, without igniting her own blades, without calling for a practice saber, she began to move. There was a form she had loved as a youngling, because it had the elegance of a bird cutting wind. She began there. The first measure felt like lying in a tongue she hadn't spoken in months. The second measure felt like apology, but not to the room. Somewhere around the fifth pass, her muscles remembered how to sing without needing her to think about the words. Breath met movement. Weight found the edge of her feet. By the 10th pass, sweat slicked the back of her neck, and the ache in her shoulders stopped feeling like a grievance and started feeling like gratitude. She moved from Shen to Ataru, and then into a hybrid that was mostly instinct. Ahsoka had been taught to avoid the self-indulgence of improvised flourishes for their own sake. She had learned later that improvisation could be the most honest way to move with the Force's nudge, rather than one's own will. Somewhere between a pivot and a leap, she felt the air alter by a fraction. Not hostile, not even intruding, just a presence that thinned the distances between her and the rest of the world. She finished the sequence and turned to find Yoda leaning on his stick in the doorway, eyes bright, amused not at her, but with her. He said. Still you are, even when moving. Good, that is. Stillness is easier when you're out of practice, Ahsoka said, catching her breath and then letting it go. The body surrenders because it knows it's not in charge anymore. He chuckled, a sound half cough and half bell. Dinner, remember? Stories to trade? Fish stew, perhaps. Cooked it will be, if the cooks have mercy. Then, Master, I have seen what temple kitchens can do to a root vegetable, Ahsoka said, retrieving her cloak. But I'll risk it. They walked the quiet corridor together, a small figure and a taller one, the rhythm of their feet easy. The Jedi Master's pace was not as slow as it looked. She matched it without thought. In the refectory, the night shift's hush lay like a soft blanket. A tired knight sipped broth and stared with devotion not at any object, but at the idea of it. A pair of Padawans passed a bowl back and forth, plotting something they believed was harmless, and that their instructors would find anyway. The server's line was a warm chain of steam and conversation. Yoda nodded at someone Ahsoka didn't recognize, but the someone clearly recognized the small master and relaxed a fraction, as if they'd been caught holding their breath. They sat with bowls of simple stew and rolls that Ahsoka tore into small pieces, because she had learned the art of making a small ball last a long time. Yoda stirred his with what might have been ceremonial deliberation, and then took a spoonful with clear pleasure. He made a pleased little sound that did for the stew what the Force did for the weary, made it more than it was. Tell, Yoda said, once they'd eaten enough to soften the edges of hunger. What did you learn while gone you were? Ahsoka's first thought was the catalog of techniques that had expanded in her hands, ways to blend into crowds, to anticipate street patrols' rhythms, to disarm without humiliating, to be precise in where to place a warning so it reached the right ears. But Yoda meant the other thing, that the Force gathers in places people don't think to look. She said after a time, that the myth of our order is larger than the order and smaller than the Force. That if you're hungry, you can talk about philosophy only until the moment your belly tells you to stand up and do work that will get you a meal. That some people use the war as an excuse to do harm they already wanted to do. That some use it to be brave in ways that would have embarrassed them before. She looked into the bowl, saw the sky of Coruscant in its surface, blurred and bright. That grief feels like water that rises not from the outside, but from inside the ship. Yoda's ears ticked. And of the Order's failings. Speak of those you should. Ahsoka met his gaze with frankness she would not have used years ago. We forgot how to be wrong in public. We trained leaders who were taught to never show the size of their doubts. Then we sent children to lead armies. We told them detachment, and then we asked them to be adored by those they would order to die. We pretended those things did not cut against each other. When that cut finally bled, we called it a surprise. Done? Truth. Some of this is, Yoda said. He did not flinch. And what? Of your own failings. I left because I was hurt, Ahsoka said. And because I wanted to prove I could survive without the people who didn't believe me. And because I wanted to punish you all with my absence. That last one matters. I have to carry that, because it means I wasn't as clear as I believed. She let the next words sit in the mouth like bread that needs chewing. I still think leaving was right. But my reasons were not all right. Living you are, Yoda said, eyes smiling now. Not a statue, no, nor a legend in a book half read. Good, this is. They ate in companionable quiet. Ahsoka watched a server fill a pot with faintly lavender liquid that would become tea, and saw how the steam lifted and then disappeared, drawn into the refectory's careful vents. It made her think of voices, of sudden warnings that turned to nothing because no one knew where to set them down. She considered the feeling inside her, the storm before storm pressure. If she named it to Yoda, would it give it shape it didn't yet deserve? If she didn't name it, would she be refusing a clear duty to warn? Yoda lowered his spoon, and as if hearing the argument assembled in her head, turned his face fractionally toward the far wall. The move was so slight, she might have missed it once. Meditate with me, he said. After eating. In the fountain's room, Much there is to hear in waters fall. They went. The fountain's room had gathered more shadow while they'd eaten, and its lamps now made islands on the water's surface. The sound of falling became a movable veil. Ahsoka sat, cross-legged, and let the stones cool seep into her calves. Yoda settled with extraordinary care, as if each small bone's voice mattered. She closed her eyes and let her breath travel into the spaces behind the bones of her face, and out again. She did not reach for stillness. She reached for attention, which she had learned was not the same as calm. The sound of the water was not one sound, but hundreds. Somewhere, a youngling laughed, and it echoed like a pebble tossed into a pool. Somewhere, boots passed, the steps dampened by mats. Somewhere, in the city beyond, a siren rose and fell. She did not push any of it away. She let it happen, and happened with it. The pressure at the center of her chest did not disappear. It was not an enemy. It was weather. If she listened closely, it had its own pattern. Not a pulse. A wind pattern, over hills one could only feel. At the edges of that weather, a voice like a call stretched across a chasm. It was not words. It was the quality of words. She knew the signature of voices in the Force, now the way a musician hears the same instrument, even when it plays new melodies. Yoda's breath was a stone's breath, deep, patient. His presence shifted in a way that made Ahsoka's skin cool. He whispered then, in a tone that seemed to be for someone else, as much as for her. "Old friend," he said, and the phrase carried an entire galaxy. "Guide me you do, even now. Our own. Guide us both." Ahsoka did not open her eyes. The back of her neck prickled. She didn't need Yoda to say the name. She saw, unbidden, a sun-dappled glade on a world that did not appear on most star charts, and two figures that were as simple as a story and as complicated as history. She had heard Obi-Wan recount the tales in the wry voice of a man who never quite believed the universe would make space for a miracle. She had heard Anakin speak of the voice that had reached them, late and early. She knew the name that meant, for the Order, a doorway to something their training had neglected to prepare them for. "Qui-Gon, Master," Yoda whispered again, and the word was not for Ahsoka. "Closer the veil is. Speak, if you can." Ahsoka felt the weather change. Not abate. Shift. For a half-breath, the water's noise thinned and thickened in a way that made her think of someone stepping through beaded curtains. A warmth brushed her right temple. Not a hand. The idea of one. Then a quality of attention. one that made the space around her spine brighter, like a hearth gently stoked. No words came across the chasm in a form the ears would know. But something else did, and the something else was this. Do not stand at the edge of the city and shout at the storm. Walk into the streets and speak to the lamps. Tell them to be ready. Remember that the most powerful acts take the quietest forms. The world will turn on a hinge no one sees. Ahsoka's breath deepened. Across from her, Yoda nodded once and closed his eyes more fully, as if to receive something he had been awaiting for years. The warmth at Ahsoka's temple faded, not gone but dispersed, like spice in a pot that has learned the shape of the water. By the time they rose, the night had tipped toward the hour when even Coruscant admitted it was tired. They parted in the hallway with no ceremony. Ahsoka found a guest cell that smelled faintly of cedar and old tea. She washed the day from her skin and lay on the narrow bed, and let the ceiling's pale light make a patient ellipse on her corneas. Sleep did not come at once. When it did, it came like a soft-sided ship, docking with no clang, only a gentle push and a sigh of seals. She woke before dawn. The temple's morning had a color she recognized, a slightly green transparency before the light learned again how to be gold. She dressed and went to the training cell, and found it empty, except for a small Mirialan boy, standing on one leg with his arms spread, and his brow furrowed in ferocious concentration. His pauldron strap was twisted, and one of his bootlaces was untied, as if he had not wanted to break the spell by fixing it. When he saw her, he startled, stumbled, and caught himself with a gracelessness so complete it felt like an achievement. "Sorry," he blurted. "For breathing," Ahsoka said, eyebrows up. "For existing loudly," he said, and then realized that sounded exactly as it sounded and made a face at himself. "What's your name?" she asked, kneeling to fix the strap and gesture at the lace. "Tell," he said. Then, remembering, "Tell Nasi. I was practicing balance. Master Aaron says it's important to balance before you try to jump." "Then?" "Master Aaron is right," Ahsoka said. "Balance is also easier when your foot isn't trying to escape your boot." She tied the lace, not too tight. "Show me the one leg stand again." He did, instantly more competent under watch. Ahsoka walked around him, angling his foot a hair, nudging his hip in by the pressure of one finger. She did not speak more than necessary. He settled. The air settled around him in sympathy. She felt the moment in which he thought of impressing her, and then let the thought drift to the ceiling like a balloon that would become a lesson once it burst. "Good," she said. "Now close your eyes." He did, and wobbled at once, and then fought the wobble, and then surrendered to the sway so he didn't topple. Ahsoka felt the room welcome that surrender. She smiled, because good beginnings were good. By the time the day fully arrived, the salle had filled with 3 other younglings. A Nautolan girl whose curiosity buzzed in the Force like an electrical line, a human boy with quick hands and a lonely streak he hid with jokes, and a Togruta child younger than Ahsoka had been when she entered the temple. Ahsoka let them think they were showing her their kata. She corrected here and there, never where pride would be bruised. She mirrored rather than led, then led rather than mirrored, and all the while watched how the Force lay on them like sunlight at different hours. When the lesson ended, they left in a clatter of questions and declarations. The lonely boy gave her a look that was almost not defiant. She gave him a look that was almost a dare. The smallest Togruta tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Are your stripes real?" And Ahsoka said solemn, "No, I paint them on new every morning," and the girl's eyes widened and then narrowed with dawning suspicion, and then she grinned and fled. Ahsoka's own smile followed her into the hall, and was replaced by a more complicated expression when she turned a corner and nearly collided with Anakin. He looked for a moment, like a man on a battlefield who has found that the next breath brings not a blaster bolt, but a familiar voice. His mouth opened and didn't decide on a word. Then he did what he always did when he didn't know whether to shout or laugh. He grinned, his whole face lit with that slightly dangerous warmth, the warmth of a sun that didn't know it would someday go red giant on those who depended on it. "You," he said. It was accusation and welcome and disbelief. You're here." "I am," she said. She saw everything at once. The exhaustion tucked behind his eyes, the little furrow between his brows that had deepened even since she saw him last, the hair a fraction too long, the scar on his cheek a darker line this morning as if sleep had pressed it into stronger relief. She saw the way he shifted his weight, ready to stride somewhere not because it was needed, but because movement was his solution to every unsolved thing. "I knew you'd come back," he said, as if he hadn't known it all, as if saying it out loud made it true retroactively. "Obi-Wan's he's on assignment. He's going to miss making one of those dramatic speeches about you returning and the light finding its proper shape." He was talking too fast. He reached for her as if to shake her shoulder, then changed his mind and ran his palm down the air in front of him, like a man smoothing a cloth on an invisible table. You look better." "Than what?" "Than the picture in my head," he said, then looked away, embarrassed by the honesty. He found composure, as he always did, by putting on the uniform of humor. "Are you here to save the order from itself?" "Good timing. We could use someone with your bad ideas." "Now." "I'm here to make the younglings tie their boots," she said. "And maybe to teach you how to sleep." He snorted. A small color rose to his cheekbones. "I sleep," he said in the tone of someone who knows he is lying and must make the lie sound like a challenge. He sobered abruptly, the way great cliffs can look playful until the moment you stand at their edge. "I'm glad," he said. The words were simple and heavy as a gift in two hands. She felt an impulse to press him, to say, "I can feel a door behind your eyes, and I want to know what you're hiding there." She did not. She had learned which questions made people harden, and which made them open in their own time. "Walk with me?" she said instead. They walked. They talked of small things that mattered because they were small. The terrible stew. A Padawan who had beaten Anakin at Dejarik by accident and thus by genius. A starfighter with an intermittent complaint that Anakin swore he could hear, but no one else could. His voice steadied into something less fevered. The set of his shoulders eased as if a strap had been untied. In a quiet alcove they paused, and Ahsoka leaned her back against a pillar. Anakin stood with his arms crossed and his gaze turned toward the long view of Coruscant. She watched him as he watched the city and thought, "Those lights are 1,000 lives, and he would defend them all, even if he had to burn his hands on the act of defending." She thought, "He is already holding a secret like a hot coal and pretending it doesn't scorch him." She'd learned that if you stood too close to a man who prized heroism, the heat might become your own. "Do you ever get the feeling," she said carefully, "that you're moving on tracks laid by someone who isn't you?" Anakin's head inclined by a hair. "All the time," he said. His voice was light. He meant it. He also meant the opposite. "It's called the war. Maybe it's called something else," she said. "I can't tell yet." He didn't ask what. He didn't because he knew too well, or because he knew and didn't want to know. "Well, whatever it is, we'll handle it," he said, and some part of his soul she could not see lifted a banner and marched toward a horizon he couldn't name. Later, when the day had lived a long time, and the temple had eaten, and the fountain's room had refilled and drained of people again, Ahsoka slid into the archives. The stillness there was a different kind of stillness than the fountains. Less moving water, more stone stacked into thought. Jocasta Nu was not at her desk. Ahsoka moved among the stacks with a hand skimming along the spines of knowledge. She did not search the main catalog. She found the shelf where small, quiet accounts sat, tucked between treatises that made greater claims. She took down a scroll-like data wrap whose label had nearly faded and read about a general of the Old Republic who had refused a campaign not because his cause was weak, but because his soldiers were. He had been censured and then, much later, thanked by those who had lived to rebuild. She read the margin notes of a 27th century archivist who had underlined a passage with affection and an admission that she had once tried to be brave in the wrong way. She placed the scroll back and sat on the floor with her back to the shelf. The pressure in her chest was steadier now. She breathed with it. She looked up at the vaulted ceiling, and in the stonework she saw a pattern that did not resolve into yet. The world held its breath, but not the shallow breath of a coward hiding. The longer, deeper breath you take before you swim under a ship. She thought of speaking to Rex again when he returned, of asking him to watch for anomalies in his brothers that he could not name. She thought of telling Yoda the word that wasn't a word Qui-Gon had put at her temple. She thought of small acts that would not register on any chart. She thought of lamps. When the curfew gong sounded for the youngest younglings, she rose and returned to the cell. She left a note on a slate. Training at dawn, bring your willingness. She added a small doodle, a lothcat drawn with 2 quick lines and a grin, because she had learned that sometimes you needed to tell laughter where to stand, so it would be present when you got there. She stood in the doorway and looked back once. The room glowed with the sort of light that transforms the ordinary into the sacred by the simple act of being attended to. Her montrals picked up the echo of feet from far down the hall. Somewhere, the temple's ventilation changed its tune. She felt sudden and sure, like the hinge the city would turn on might be small enough to carry in her pocket and heavy enough to anchor an empire. Beyond the window, Coruscant breathed in 10,000 rhythms. Somewhere out there, a theater filled with citizens who had been promised 2 hours in which no one would tell them the truth. Somewhere out there, a senator rehearsed a lie he had told so often he had begun to trust its shape. Somewhere out there, a man in a black robe smiled at his reflection and saw in it not his face, but the face of history. Somewhere in the temple, a master sat alone and let tears fall where no one would see them, because love was sometimes too large even for a Jedi to hold without spilling. Ahsoka turned out the lights in the salle one by one. She walked the corridor with her hands folded as if she were carrying a bowl of water she did not want to spill. She kept her pace deliberate, because the city would offer her speed at every turn and call it wisdom. At the edge of sleep that night, a warmth at her temple, the memory of a hand that had never touched her and never needed to. And she knew that what came would ask her to be both more gentle and more fierce than she had ever been. In another part of the temple, Anakin watched the city and pressed his tongue to the back of his teeth, as if that act could keep him from speaking a name aloud. In the Senate rotunda, under the gaze of 1,000 lights, a man folded his hands and waited for the galaxy to arrive exactly on time. In the barracks, a clone whose designation had become a nickname dreamed of snow and woke with his heart racing and no idea why. In the fountains room, Yoda lifted his head, smiled at nothing anyone else could see, and whispered old words into the new night. The lamps of Coruscant held their places. Their filaments glowed. The storm did what storms do, gathered itself at a distance, practicing the art of arrival, and trusted that when it entered the city, it would find everyone exactly where they were. Ahsoka slept, and on the inside of her eyelids, she saw the training cell full of children with their hands outstretched, not pleading, not demanding, but measuring a space between what is and what will be, and she reached back. Okay. Dawn laid a thin wash of mint over the temple stones. The day's first wind moved across the upper terraces and set the pennants along the meditation walk to a soft, steady ripple. Ahsoka reached the salle before the light learned how to be gold. Her note was gone from the slate. Prints of small feet in resin dust ringed the mat like petals. She centered herself with the same practical reverence she would use to center a blade on a whetstone. When the door sighed open, Tel stumped in with his boots double-knotted, and a seriousness that made his ears seem larger. Behind him padded the Nautolan girl, Nima, her head-tails damp from a too-early rinse. Then the human boy, Cade, affecting a slouch that evaporated the moment he started to move. And the youngest, Togruta, Selly, still unsure whether she stood in a room or inside a story. They worked with breath and gravity, with the honest negotiation between balance and fall, with the correct angle of a knee that would matter later when the stakes were not a scuffed shin, but a life held or spared. Ahsoka corrected gently, praised specifically, and when Cade made a joke that had too much teeth in it, she let the silence look at him until he removed the teeth himself. When they were warm and loose and pleased with the room, She stacked 4 small practice spheres on the floor and let their shadows fall careful squares on the mat. "We're going to talk about lamps," she said. 4 faces, 4 circuits of attention, bright and busy. "Do any of you know the old story about the village that hung lamps in its windows when the storm came?" Hands rose. Nima's eyes had the shine of a child who already knows the ending and is hungry for the beginning again. "In the story," Ahsoka said, "they didn't put the lamps out so they could see the storm. They put the lamps out so they could see one another. They made a map from light. So today, each of you is going to learn to be a lamp. Not to fight storms, to let someone find you in one." She put the spheres into their palms one by one. "Close your eyes," she said. "Hold the sphere. Make your breath even. Don't push the force. Listen. When your breath and your heartbeat stop arguing, the sphere will feel warmer. When it does, lift your hand, slowly." They did. Sally's sphere warmed before she expected it to, and she startled and dropped it and snatched it and blushed. "Good," Ahsoka said. "That startle is what tells you were trying, and then you were listening." She moved among them, a constant heat in the room's weather. When they lifted their hands in their turn, the spheres rose with them. Hardly at all, a good beginning. "Now," she said. "Smile a secret between them. I want you to think of someone you trust very much, not a teacher. Someone you would go to if you were ever frightened. You don't need to tell me who. Just know their name. On your breath." Tell's face softened until his balance became a thin groan rather than made. Cade's mouth stopped testing the edges of its own smirk. Nima went quiet in a way that made the room deepen. Sally blinked wet, and then, without instruction, set her feet wider and made herself large, as if she could be a wall you'd be glad to lean on. "Good," Ahsoka said. "Now open your eyes. This is lamp work. You will do it 5 breaths at a time every day. You will do it when you are old, and when you are hungry, and when you are sad. 5 breaths is all it takes to put a light where someone can find it. Remember, the storm is not the only thing in the story." She put her hand on the mat, palm flat, felt the small thrum of the temple's hidden machinery far below. "We are." By the time she dismissed them, the temple had stretched into its full morning. Voices accumulated in the corridors, like threads that would later braid into something sturdy. She watched them go with the mixture of hope and worry that had always visited her when young people left a room she'd warmed for them. A wish to put a cloak around each as they walked, and the knowledge that the cloak had to be one they learned to weave themselves. Rex found her an hour later, dusty, smiling with fatigue only because he had decided that was better than grim. "We're back," he said, as if she couldn't tell that from the smell of travel and the pattern of their boots in the hangar. Felucia was Felucia. "Mushrooms tried to be buildings again, but we didn't let them. You've got admirers." He nodded toward the hallway down which the younglings had dispersed. "Jesse says if you're training younglings you'll be too soft on us." Jesse would complain that gravity was biased if it made him trip, Ahsoka said. Then, quieter, "How'd the boys sleep?" Rex didn't answer right away. The pause wasn't a secret. It was a check. "Kix says he's never given out so much tea," he said. "Bad dreams. More of them. Not about battles. Waking up and finding their hands already doing something and not knowing why. I told him to make a note. He made 6. They walked where the hangar noise thinned, and a small utility alcove offered them a square of quiet. Ahsoka leaned against a coil of hose and kept her voice even. "I want to run some checks. Nothing that'll scare the medics. Nothing that'll make the brass think we're inventing a new procedure. Just baselines. Sleep cycles. Neuro-echo readings. Kix will know what I mean. I want to know their rhythms before something tries to change the beat." "Mention." Rex watched her the way he watched a battlefield, measuring the work, estimating the cost. "You want to tell me what you think you're seeing?" he asked. I think I'm feeling what I think I'm seeing, she said. And I think Fives tried to hand us a map, and we didn't take it. And now we have to draw it ourselves before we need it. Rex's jaw moved. His face did nothing else for a long heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, the room's air grew heavy with the absence of a name. When he spoke, it was level. All right, he said. We do it quiet. We do it right. Kix didn't need to be convinced. He had the look of a man who had listened to his instruments until he began to suspect the instrument was the room. In the medbay he showed Ahsoka a set of compiled readings that, in their tranquility, would have been reassuring if not for the small glitching artifact that appeared here and there. A scraped note in a clean melody. This is within variance, Kix said. He pointed with a blunt fingertip. This too. But this. I don't like this. It's like the dream reaches a hand into the waking and leaves fingerprints. Dow. Does it cluster? Ahsoka asked. Nah, it tastes like it wants to, Kix said, scrubbing his beard with the back of his knuckles. Rex said you wanted baselines. And scans, Ahsoka said. Not the intrusive kind, the ones you do for a concussion workup. Kix looked at her without blinking. You want to go looking for that thing no one wants to say out loud, he said, without saying it out loud. He didn't mean a word so much as the air around a word. I want a map before the storm, Ahsoka said. Kix nodded once. Then we start with the boys who won't flinch at more time in the medbay. Jesse. Hard case isn't here. May the Force, Dogmaul complain but show. Rex obviously, and I'll slip it into the routine. Hells, I'll call it routine. You'll tell me if anything sings off key, Ahsoka said. I'll hum in your doorway until you throw something at me, Kix said, and was already setting a tray with the white dish of gel, the gentle curves of the scanner head. Ahsoka left him to it and walked toward the temple's far side, where the quiet was of a different quality, and asked to see Jocasta Nu. The archivist regarded her over lenses that glowed with their own industry. And what strange corner of our library does your mind insist on visiting today? Jocasta said, voice fond in a way that always sounded like impatience to those who hadn't learned its true grammar. I'm looking for record of a clone's report, Ahsoka said, choosing words that wouldn't activate the archivist's defenses. ACT 5,555. I know the official files are sealed. I'm not requesting those. I'm asking if there are notations adjacent to them. Cross-references. A keyword that appears in other places. Whisper. Dendawana. Jocasta's mouth did something like a smile if seen through a veil. The whispers are louder than you think, she said, rising with care that reminded Ahsoka of Yoda and not at all of Yoda. Follow, Dirt 2. They moved through a side aisle that smelled faintly of insulating paint and old epoxy, where data wraps lay like cats claiming sun. Jocasta selected a thin wafer and fed it into a reader with the tenderness of one who respects machines for the work they allow people to do. Lines of text rose, spare and plain. Ahsoka read the connective tissue of bureaucracy, where human worry had been muscled into official shape. Here, Jocasta said, tapping a finger beside a number. Soft redactions. Not a firm hand, a careful one. That's a Kaminoan's touch. Polite deletions, like a house guest hiding the good dishes from a clumsy hostess. The index that remains tells you more than they intended. Inhibitor. Ahsoka read softly. The word had the taste of metal on the tongue. Cognitive. Behavioral constraint. Try this cross-reference to medtech, Jocasta said, unruffled by horror, the way librarians are unruffled by weather. I advise caution. Your hope will try to read itself in the margins. Keep your shape. Ahsoka inhaled. She kept her shape. She brought the file up and read about a small sliver of bioengineered tissue placed early as a shepherd's crook tucked into a brain's flock. She read the language written to make a horror sound like a solution. She read 3 separate phrases for what a human would simply call a compulsion. She closed her eyes and saw Fives running through a hallway, the smear of his body's motion the same shape as an exclamation. You'll be careful, Jocasta said softly, which was how a good archivist said, go make the right trouble. Ahsoka thanked her and left, the word inhibitor echoing and dimming, echoing again. She found a spare calm alcove, closed her eyes, and reached toward the cool distance where she remembered Shakti often stayed. A measured, strong strand in the temple's whiter weave. When the hollow panel warmed, the blue was the particular blue of distant rooms and complicated loyalty. Padawan Tano. Shakti said. It was not a correction, it was a test. Ahsoka took it without flinch. Ahsoka is fine, she said. Master, I need. There are anomalies in troopers' sleep patterns. In their neuroechoes. It's not fatigue alone. I've read the adjacent records to CT 5555's case. Not the sealed ones. Enough. I need to know what you learned on Camino. That didn't make it into the Senate-friendly report. The pause on the other end was not a refusal. It was a page turned carefully. There's a thing in their heads. Shakti said, voice still as a blade laid on a table. Placed there by design. The Kaminoans described it as a governor, a safeguard. I called it an abrogation. I have not yet persuaded anyone with more power than I that my word is the correct one. Ahsoka's mouth went dry. Do you have a way to remove it? We have a way to see it, Shakti said. We have a way to reach it. We do not have a way to remove it without risking the life we intend to save. The Kaminoans insist the chip is integral to the clone's stability. I believe their confidence exceeds their knowledge. The chip can be disabled temporarily. The procedure is delicate and would require a medical team practiced in it. We have one. We are three. We cannot be everywhere. Then? Ahsoka leaned one shoulder against the alcove's smooth frame. Can you share the method? Yes. Shakti said, with the unadorned economy that made her as formidable as any general in the field. I will transmit it in a form Kix can trust. He will need to build a device. He will need to call it something else, so he can use it without being told to stop. Men? Thank you, Ahsoka said. They held one another's silent gaze through the blue wash and the distance. Tell me what you worry about at night, she added, because sometimes the question you need is not in the manual. Shakti's eyes softened by a degree. I worry the word that activates the horror is not a word at all. She said, I worry it is a pattern, a shape of authority, a breath in the ear with a certain history in it. I worry that when it arrives it will be everywhere at once, and that our courage will only save the ones we can reach by hand. Then we run faster than we've ever run, Ahsoka said. Or we build the hands we need before the fire, Shakti said. The lamps, yes, Ahsoka breathed, the smallest laugh a salve. The lamps, she said. The hololight cooled and dimmed. She stayed a moment longer and listened to her own heartbeat, make a credible imitation of steadiness. In the afternoon, after she had eaten something soft and brown that tasted better than it looked, and worse than she pretended, Ahsoka walked out into Coruscant in a cloak that fell the way water falls when it's tired. The city had put on its mid-shift face, brisk, a little short with those who wanted poetry from it, full of the business of keeping itself humming. She rode a slow transit 2 loops around the temple quarter, watching the rhythm of patrols, where the checkpoints thickened and thinned, which alleys were trusted shortcuts and which were wells people avoided. She got off near a little noodle stall, whose owner had, once, when she was 19 and dust-wet and staring into the space where a friend had not returned, pushed a bowl across the counter without a demand for credits and said, "E8, it will help exactly enough." She bought a bowl and ate in the same spot, and felt the city recognize her in that unthinking way places do. A slight easing in the air, like a shoulder letting down an inch, because a known weight has returned to it. At 79's, the clones bar that pretended to be more disreputable than it was, the evening was just beginning to inhale. Ahsoka went to the side door, because she had learned that walking into a room through the door everyone used is not always the way to be welcome. Jesse saw her first. He was halfway through a story about a gunship that swore it would land on a pad that didn't exist, and he finished the sentence with decorum before he shouted, "Well, if it isn't the general who pretends not to be a general." "I'm a clerk now," Ahsoka said. "I teach children to stand on one foot." "That's mercy work," Jesse said solemnly. "Some of us never learn." He made room at a table, and the table made room for her. The shift of shoulders quiet and grateful. Hands clasped her forearm in the brief, strong greeting of soldiers who want to say more than they can. "Tell me your dreams," Ahsoka said, when the first round had soaked the jagged edges of their day. She didn't make it an order. She made it a dare. "Tell me the strange ones. The ones where you wake up and look at your hands and don't know whose they are for a second." Johnny. A hush held them. Not the wary one, but the honest one that falls when someone asks a question that's been waiting for its name. Dogma spoke first, because Dogma's strictness had made him brave in this particular way. "I dream I'm on Camino," he said. "But the rain is inside and the halls are outside. And there's a door. It's closed. I know it's mine. I don't remember locking it." "Do you ever open it?" Ahsoka asked. "No," Dogma said. "I don't want to. But I wake up with my hand on the wall like I tried." "Damn." Jesse sat with his fist on the table, not to hit, just to feel something under it. "Mine is somebody saying my number like a prayer, and I'm supposed to answer, 'Amen,' but I can't get my mouth to." He broke off. "And then I do, and I wake up saying it." Kix wrote with his thumb on the condensation his cup had made, the way medics acquire the habit of writing, even when there is nothing to write with. "I'll add this to the file," he said. "And I'll tell you why I'm asking the questions I'm asking so you don't think I'm inventing new ways to fuss." They laughed, gratefully, at the soft jab at their medic. Ahsoka let the room grow loud again and stayed silent within it, content to be a lamp at a table where men who had been made to be instruments were being human, because they insisted and because they could. When she left, the street had taken on the lemon sour of late evening, when speeders breathe differently and conversations sharpen. She moved without hurry through the throng. A man in a senatorial cloak passed with his aide, and didn't notice that every third person he brushed lifted a hand to their pocket, as if to ensure the credits they had weren't the ones he had. Across an intersection, a holoscreen showed the day's Senate docket, and the Chancellor's name above an item that would make people nod because it sounded like safety. The holoscreen's sound was down. Ahsoka heard the speech anyway. She heard the cadence Palpatine used when he wanted to plant something in the soil of the city and harvest it 3 days later. She went to the Senate gallery the following day, because to be accurate you sometimes have to watch the puppet master's hands while the show happens. She sat in the high seats with students and staffers and 2 parents who had brought a child, because they believed good behavior was a thing that could be learned by proximity. Palpatine read from a slate and occasionally set it aside, as if the words came more naturally to him than to the slate. He spoke of the war's end, which even in the gallery's poor acoustics sounded like a promise remade into a threat, and then back again. He spoke of the need for timetables and the danger of deadlines. He smiled rarely and then well. Ahsoka watched not him, but the small shifts in those who watched him. Masameda's head tilted not to hear better but to anticipate an applause line. Orn-Free Ta blinked as if the words were lights too bright for the hour. Padme Amidala sat like a question, full of the weight of what she did not say. Ahsoka looked at Padme and sensed not just the life the senator carried, but the way she carried it, with courage and calculation, one wrapped around the other like braided cloth. Ahsoka didn't let her gaze linger. She had learned that respect sometimes announces itself better with restraint than with attention. When the session adjourned, the gallery began its slow calving of bodies. Palpatine looked up once, not randomly, and Ahsoka had the sudden, absolute conviction that he had known she would be there, that he could smell the temple on her cloak from a floor below, that he had already given her a nickname in his mind that sounded like praise and meant tool. Their gazes did not meet, and yet she felt the weight of being noticed by someone for whom noticing was an act, not of curiosity but of architecture. On her way down from the gallery, Anakin's stride found hers. It was pure Anakin, too fast by a hair, too full of an energy that looked like optimism, until it had to be named as fear disguised by purpose. "You're watching politics for fun now?" he said, breathless not from the stairs, but because thinking made him breathe like running. "I'm watching power," Ahsoka said, keeping her voice easy. "Politics just happens to be the room it's using." "Clever," he said. But the word was a shield. He looked over his shoulder like a man who knows he is followed by something only he can hear. "I have to go," he said, proving the obvious, and then hesitated in a way that never failed to break her heart, because it always meant he was about to ask for something he would later pretend he hadn't asked. "Pad." "I saw her listening," Ahsoka said, rescuing him. "She listened better than anyone else did." "She usually does." He blew out a breath that let him be young for a fraction of a second. "You always," he began, and then shook his head and clamped the sentence shut. "There's a briefing," he said. "Obi-Wan called in a report from a world with more sinkholes than sense. We'll be shipping out in days." "Then sleep before you go," Ahsoka said, and when he opened his mouth to recite his arguments, she reached out and put 2 fingers on his wrist in the old way that reset their clocks to the same hour. "Not meditate. Not tinker with something until the ship thinks you've loved it more than you love yourself. Sleep." He stared at her. He didn't concede. But when he left her at the corridor's turn, his shoulders had the slope of someone who would at least try to lie down. The temple had its own underways, tunnels and service routes, and forgotten stairwells with steps worn by feet that had not belonged to anyone alive now. Ahsoka spent an afternoon listing them in her head, and then walked them in her boots. She timed how long it took to move from the salle to the archives, if the main corridors were blocked. She measured the width of a service hatch with her hands and decided how many children could crawl through without panic building like steam behind them. She found a narrow space where maintenance droids rested between shifts and spoke with one, until it consented to show her a hatch most organics didn't know. The kind of hatch that made the difference between a story with a dark middle and one with a dark end. At night, after she'd eaten with Yoda and told him a story about a woman who had traded a day's worth of labor for a single fuse, and then used it to set up a workshop that became a small business that became a steady lane of light along a dangerous alley, Ahsoka went to the fountain's room and did not sit. She walked the perimeter and touched the rail in 4 places, then 7, then 9. She counted breaths along the wall until her attention lost interest, and then brought it back gently, like coaxing a cat from a cupboard. When she stood still at last, the pressure in her chest had moved to a place lower and softer, like a weight you put on your lap on purpose because it keeps you honest. "What do you hear?" Yoda asked from a shadow that had decided to be a friend. "I hear the way water sounds different when it falls past a stone that wasn't there yesterday," Ahsoka said. "Even if it's small." Yoda said, and tapped the rail with his stick. The sound was more music than tap. "Speak to me of lamps again." "I've put lamp work in the youngling's days," she said. "I've taught Kix a thing he will call something else. I've given Rex a reason to tell Jesse to sit still without insulting him. I've marked 3 doors that can be sealed from the inside if someone outside says the wrong sentence. She stopped, because in cataloging she risked sounding like someone begging to be praised. "I've done small things because the big ones would make people ask questions I can't answer without setting the storm early." Yoda's ears made their small boat movement, catching currents even in still air. "Wise," he said. "And lonely." "Being right too early is a kind of wrong," Ahsoka said. "Some truths," Yoda said, "must be arrived at by more than one person, else brittle they will be, and break at the touch of a contrary wind." "Master," Ahsoka said, because the word sometimes broke the ice above the deeper question. "If the storm comes, and we are scattered, how do we call each other home? Without radios, without signals anyone else can use. How do we?" Yoda closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he looked less old and more ancient. "The lamps you teach," he said. "They will not shine for yourself alone. Teach them to send, mean? Not just be. A thread of attention to another, as practice as simple as tying a boot. Make of it a bell without sound." "A bell without sound," Ahsoka repeated, and felt something inside her hand her a tool she didn't yet know how to use. The next morning, She taught the younglings how to ring a bell no one could hear. It was not magic. It was direction. She had them think of someone in the room, and then think of nothing else. She had them hold the thought lightly as if they were carrying a bowl without spilling, and then she had them send the smallest pulse of attention, the kind of thing a person feels in the back of their neck when they turn at exactly the right time to see a friend entering a door. Tel felt Nima at once. He laughed and then blushed, and then stood straighter because he'd done something he hadn't believed he could. Cade resisted and resisted, and then, when the pulse got through to him anyway, he grinned like a person who has found his own weight and discovered it is not a burden. Selly held her palms out, serious as prayer, and when the feeling arrived, her eyes went wide and then soft, as if she had heard her name spoken in a place where she hadn't remembered she had a name. They practiced until the room hummed with a music only the room could hear, and when Ahsoka dismissed them, she did it gently, because the day outside was louder than the bell. Word reached her through the hall's low rumor that Obi-Wan had come in from Utapau. A general's voice filtered through a planet that refused to be simple. There would be deployments. There would be briefings that smelled of recycled air and determination. Anakin's shadow lengthened in the temple in the oddest way. He was both present and already not here. Energy leaning forward with all the force of a man who could not bear to be in two places at once, and hated both for that refusal. Before he left, Ahsoka found him on a small balcony where he'd learned to look at the city, and pretend that looking was resting. She brought him a cup of tea he didn't want, and made him hold it until his hands admitted it felt good to be warm. They didn't speak immediately. Sometimes a friendship is best proven by a period in which you say nothing, and neither of you mistakes it for absence. "I had a dream," he said at last, in the tone of a man who knows he is about to lie to himself, if he isn't careful. "It wasn't like the others. It wasn't." He stopped. "It was a door. You didn't open it," Ahsoka said. It was not a question. "No," he said, and set the tea down because he couldn't be seen drinking something as trivial as comfort when the galaxy had arranged itself as an emergency around him. "I don't like doors I didn't put there." "Then build a window beside it," Ahsoka said. "Something you can look through without going in." He looked at her, as if she told him his own name with the syllables arranged in a new order. "You get in my head," he said, and it was fond accusation. "You're easy to get into," she said. "You leave it unlocked for everyone you love. That's not a failing." "It will be," he said. He said it like a fact he had learned from the future and was trying to teach to the past. Then he shook himself like a man stepping out of a lake and fastening his cloak before the wind could make him shiver. I know," she said. She did not tell him to be careful. She had learned that some words, said at thresholds, become curses you don't intend. She put her palm flat against his shoulder, and for a moment, the weight of her hand was the only lawful thing in the city. He closed his eyes once, then again as if to keep the feeling like a coin in his pocket. Then he went. The day the temple's great doors closed for the briefest time, not because of attack, but because a senatorial delegation wanted a photograph that would read a certain way in the next morning's newsfeed. Ahsoka used the inconvenience to teach the temple guards a sequence of steps that would let them lock the secondary gates by hand if the power conduit failed. She did it by pretending to be a saboteur and forcing them to practice against her until the motions were as simple as reaching for a light when you enter a room. They took the instruction without bridal pride because their pride was in the craft of the guard, not in being flattered by a general without a title. "Who taught you those tricks?" one asked. Friendly skepticism a varnish over genuine interest. "A woman who made doors for a living," Ahsoka said. She said the best door is the one that closes quietly when the wrong person tries it. "Wise woman," the guard said. He did not ask her name, which was the way a professional shows respect. News moved through the temple like rain through a canopy, without hurry and with certainty. Plo Koon would be leaving. He stopped by the cell and watched the youngling stand on one foot. He gave Ahsoka a glance that said you stood up, and that is enough for now. Ayla Secura sent a note that consisted of a single line about balance that meant be ready to shift your weight. Mace Windu paused at the edge of the refectory and looked at Ahsoka as if she were a problem he had decided was worth the effort to solve together. Jocasta Nu pretended to scold her for replacing a data wrap incorrectly, and thereby told her she had left it exactly right. Kick's device arrived in pieces and names. He built it at a table in the medbay by the light of a lamp. Ahsoka had moved closer to him without comment. He called it a neural normalization aid, and no one in authority took it away because the name sounded like something that would keep a soldier from shaking too much after a blast. He tested it on Jesse first because Jesse insisted. The device hummed a note so low it was more feeling than sound, and Jesse blinked twice and then said, carefully, "It's like someone knocked on a wall and a mouse ran away." They logged the result without victory. They did it again, because repetitions are how the body learns it isn't being fooled. They got numbers. They made a chart. They called the columns something bland. They did not write what they called it in their heads when they were too tired to play bureaucracy's game. In the half-sleep province between midnight and morning, Ahsoka woke with a sense that someone had spoken her name in a clear voice in an empty room. She lay still and listened. Nothing in the air moved differently. The corridor's feed hummed the same pitch it always did. Her pulse slowed like a well-trained creature that knows when not to bolt. She closed her eyes again, and in that soft, dark, saw a field on which no battle had yet been fought, and a figure standing with its back to her, calm as a tree. She did not move closer. She did not call out. She stood with them from where she was, the way you stand with a person across a crowded room when walking would ruin what the moment knows. In the morning, she went to see Barriss. The cell block smelled of neutralizers and slightly stale patience. Ahsoka signed a slate and stood before a transparent steel wall that separated her from the woman who had made of conviction a blade so fine she had cut herself to the bone using it. Barriss sat with her spine long and her hands folded. She looked older and softer. She looked exactly the same. "I wondered when you would come," Barriss said. No condemnation, no welcome. The sound of a person who has learned to put the right amount of furniture in a room, and not one chair more. "I wasn't sure I should," Ahsoka said. "I didn't come to forgive you. That's not a thing I can give. I came to ask if you have anything to give that would save lives." "Ben?" Barriss's smile was a line drawn with a well-made pen. "You always were better at cutting to the necessary wound," she said. "What is it you want me to say?" "That you were right," Ahsoka said, and the words tasted like ash and fruit. "That the Order is unwell, and the war turned us into a shape we will spend a century straightening if we're lucky. You were right. But you hurt the people who could have been convinced by a different act. And now we are where we are, and I think a new kind of hurt is about to arrive. If you know anything about its source, if you ever saw a hand in the dark pushing the pieces, tell me. I won't try to make you feel better about the past. I'll try to make the future less cruel." "Then Xiao." Barriss's gaze drifted, not evasive, but in the way of someone checking a memory's bearings. "I thought exposing rot would make a garden," she said. "I forgot that sometimes you have to plant something where you tear something up." I listened to whispers. I mistook my echo for the voice of the Force. "But Ahsoka, the hand you feel? I felt it years ago. I tried to swing at it. It stepped back and let me lunge, and then it applauded. If you want to know where it likes to stand." She leaned closer, breath fogging the transparent steel like a cloud in miniature. "Watch the places where men say the word safety and mean obedience." Ahsoka nodded. It was not revelation. But sometimes being told that your guess is not madness is kinder than being handed a new map. "Thank you," she said. Barriss's eyes softened briefly. "I meant to save something," she said. "If you manage it, tell it I tried." "I will," Ahsoka said. She left the cell and stood in a hallway where the air did not believe in tears, and pressed her lips together until her body understood the rule. Then she walked back into the temple and into its light. The days that followed held the shape of preparation disguised as routine. Ahsoka taught, ate, moved, listened. The lamps were lit in places that didn't know they were being lit. In the hangar, she showed a crew chief how to lock a flight of starfighters with a mechanical shunt in case a code arrived that would turn keys against hands. In the archives, she read a fragment of a poem an anonymous knight had written 3 wars ago that described exactly the feeling she carried in her chest. In the fountains room, she stood just out of sight while a pair of Padawans argued kindly about whether detachment meant indifference. When they found their way to the answer, she did not step out to claim credit for their thinking. She let them keep their discovery. When she passed through the temple's high atrium late one afternoon, she saw a youngling standing alone, looking up at the great window, as if the city were a storybook she had not yet learned how to read. Ahsoka stood beside her at a respectful angle. "What do you see?" Ahsoka asked. The girl didn't answer at once. "I see 100,000 doors," she said finally. "And inside each one is a person who thinks they're the only person. I don't know if that's sad or good." "It's true," Ahsoka said. "And sometimes truth is the only thing you can keep in your pocket when you don't know whether to be sad." The girl nodded, as if she'd been handed a small fruit. She tucked it away somewhere inside, to be eaten later when her body needed its sugar. Ahsoka found herself, more than once, at the edge of a conversation she wanted to have with Anakin, and didn't. It sat between them like a sealed box. She could not open it. To pry would be to break something more important than a secret. So she did what you do when you cannot fix a friend. You went on loving them in public and in private. You showed up. You made tea he wouldn't drink. You told him true things about ships, so he could rest his mind against a surface he trusted. When the call came for deployments, it moved through the temple with a sound like a book shut by a careful hand. Ships lifted. Cloaks were folded and hung. The refectory rose to feed those who would leave and those who would worry about them from a distance. Anakin's absence became a laminate on the walls. Obi-Wan's voice, relayed from elsewhere, was calm to the point of mischief. Yoda sat longer in the fountains room each night, and every now and then smiled as if someone had told him a joke only he could hear. The Chancellor called for a special session. The city changed its pitch in anticipation. Ahsoka moved through it with her cloak, and her training, and her small, cunning gifts. She felt the hinge approach. She felt the word that wasn't a word roll toward them, with the casual force of a tide that believes in itself, because it always has. She looked at the lamp she had set. She looked at the youngling standing on one foot, and at Kix's chart, and at Rex's tired dignity, and at Yoda's patience. She looked at the door in her own chest, and saw that it had a window now. The storm did what storms do. It readied itself. Ahsoka did what a person must. She readied herself without letting readiness become an altar where fear could kneel. On the last quiet evening before quiet learned a new meaning, she walked the temple's outer parapet alone. The air had a mineral taste, as if the sky were grinding its teeth. Far below, Coruscant's lanes gleamed, and the traffic flowed like a river that couldn't remember what dams were. A flock of city birds turned as one, and then scattered, because the city asked that of them. Ahsoka stood with her palms on the cool stone and closed her eyes. She rang a bell without sound and felt, in the subtle feedback that touched the back of her neck, 4 distinct answers. A captain in a barracks rolling onto his back and looking at the ceiling for no reason he could name. A medic bent over an instrument, thinking he had forgotten to check something, and checking it again. An old master in a room full of water whose heart answered as if it had been asked the simplest question. A child standing in a dormitory with one foot tucked in the udders. She opened her eyes. She could have sworn that for a second the city's lights were not entirely a property of electricity. Some of them looked like attention made visible, held steady against the wind. She breathed 5 times, as a lamp would. Then she went inside because inside was where the work would be, and because the door needed to be closed gently behind her, in case someone she loved came looking, and needed to find the latch exactly where it had always been.